the camera stopped transmitting before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. According to investigators, that interruption happened during the same overnight period in which an unidentified man was seen near the property. Publicly released information later confirmed that authorities considered the timing significant enough to involve federal investigators almost immediately. Think about that for a moment. In most missing persons cases, investigators first try to determine whether someone left voluntarily. But when surveillance systems fail close to the moment a person vanishes, the investigation changes very quickly. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, that shift appears to have happened early. According to publicly available reports, Nancy returned home after spending time with family the evening before she disappeared. Earlier footage from that day reportedly showed her behaving normally, calm, relaxed, unaware that anything was wrong. Investigators pay close attention to details like that because behavior often establishes the starting point of a timeline. Did the person appear fearful, distracted, under pressure? In Nancy's case, publicly available information suggests none of those warning signs were obvious. And that is where the first contradiction begins. Because only hours later, multiple systems connected to her home and personal monitoring reportedly stopped communicating. First, the surveillance disruption. Then, later, the loss of the pacemaker monitoring signal associated with Nancy. Separately, those details might not immediately stand out. Together, investigators appear to believe they matter. But that wasn't the detail that drew the most attention behind the scenes. According to official statements, investigators quickly began gathering surveillance footage not only from the immediate area surrounding Nancy's home, but from nearby streets and neighboring routes connected to the neighborhood. That distinction matters, because when investigators widen a timeline, they are usually trying to answer a more complicated question. Not simply, what happened that night, but did anything connected to the event begin earlier? This is where the investigation quietly becomes more methodical than many people realize. Publicly available records suggest investigators reviewed activity leading up to the disappearance in an effort to identify unusual movement patterns, unfamiliar vehicles, or repeated appearances near the property. That does not confirm a coordinated operation, but it does suggest investigators believe the surrounding timeline could contain important answers. And experienced investigators know something most people overlook. Important evidence is often not hidden in dramatic moments. It's hidden in ordinary details, repeated one too many times. Think about that carefully. A vehicle that passes once means very little. A vehicle that appears repeatedly before a disappearance suddenly becomes more important. And according to the FBI, investigators are especially interested in an unidentified male seen near Nancy Guthrie's property during the overnight hours surrounding the disappearance. Officials described the individual as carrying a backpack and appearing to tamper with surveillance equipment connected to the residence. That detail changed the public understanding of the case almost immediately. Because once surveillance equipment appears to be intentionally disrupted, investigators begin evaluating the possibility that the disappearance involved planning rather than impulse. And planning changes the entire structure of an investigation. Cases like this often change quietly, one detail at a time. New footage surfaces, timeline shift, investigators release information slowly. So, if you follow real-world investigations and want updates grounded in publicly available evidence rather than rumors, consider subscribing to SilentVerdict. And if there's a detail in this case that stands out to you personally, let us know in the comments. Investigators often revisit the smallest contradictions repeatedly, because sometimes that's where the entire timeline begins to change. This is where the forensic side of the case becomes critical. According to reporting tied to the investigation, DNA evidence was recovered from inside the residence. Officials have not publicly explained whose DNA was found, whether it was previously known to investigators, or whether it directly connects to Nancy's disappearance. And that silence is important, because investigators often withhold forensic details for one reason: to protect the integrity of the investigation itself. Think about that for a moment. If investigators publicly reveal every forensic detail too early, they lose the ability to distinguish truthful information from false confessions, misleading tips, or manufactured stories. So when officials remain careful about forensic evidence, it does not necessarily mean investigators lack information. Sometimes it means the opposite. But that wasn't the only element investigators reportedly focused on. Digital timelines also became central to the investigation. Phones, applications, surveillance systems, signal interruptions. Modern investigations are no longer built solely around eyewitnesses. They are built around synchronized activity, or synchronized silence. According to publicly available reporting, multiple digital systems connected to Nancy Guthrie stopped transmitting within a relatively narrow period of time. Investigators have not publicly stated whether those disruptions were directly connected. But analysts following the case believe authorities are likely examining whether the sequence reflects coincidence, technical failure, or intentional interference. And this is where the story begins to shift again, because physical evidence tells investigators where something happened. Digital evidence often tells them how. Early in the investigation, public attention naturally focused on people closest to Nancy. That is standard in nearly every major missing persons case. Family members, close contacts, recent interactions. Investigators routinely examine all of it. But publicly, authorities have not named Nancy's family members as suspects. That distinction is extremely important because online speculation and official investigations often move in completely different directions. The internet tends to move emotionally. Investigators move evidentially. And evidence rarely follows public assumptions in a straight line. This is one reason experienced investigators become cautious when a case appears too simple too early. Simple explanations often collapse under forensic review. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators appear to be dealing with several contradictions simultaneously. There were reportedly no immediate signs of violent forced entry, yet surveillance systems were disrupted. An unidentified individual was reportedly near the property. Nancy disappeared. And investigators later began expanding the timeline outward instead of narrowing it inward. Think about what that combination suggests. Not conclusion, question. Because investigators are trained not to force evidence into a theory, they force theories to survive the evidence. And right now, the evidence publicly known in this case still leaves several possibilities open. This is where logistics become one of the quietest but most important parts of the investigation. Removing an elderly woman from a residential area without immediately drawing attention creates enormous practical risks. Movement increases exposure. Vehicles increase visibility. Timing creates vulnerability. Investigators understand that, which is why analysts believe authorities are likely reconstructing movement through the neighborhood minute by minute, camera by camera, route by route. Not only who approached the property, but who left the area afterward, and whether any movement pattern appears more than once across separate pieces of surveillance footage, because repeated movement matters, especially when investigators are trying to determine whether someone understood the neighborhood before the disappearance occurred. But there is one detail investigators have still not publicly answered. If the individual seen near the surveillance system understood cameras well enough to interfere with them, why allow any image of themselves to appear at all? Think about that carefully, because experienced investigators know most planned crimes are not solved by major mistakes. They are solved by partial mistakes. A movement slightly out of place, a vehicle appearing twice, a route repeated unnecessarily, a camera overlooked for only a few seconds. And investigators often spend months reconstructing those fragments until a pattern finally emerges. Right now, publicly available information suggests that is exactly the stage this investigation may be entering. Not a conclusion stage, a reconstruction stage, piece by piece, signal by signal, movement by movement. Because the central question may no longer be simply who approached Nancy Guthrie's home that night. The larger question may be this: who understood the environment well enough to move through it quietly, while still leaving behind just enough evidence for investigators to start rebuilding the timeline afterward? By the second week of the investigation, the search around Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had already expanded far beyond the house itself. That detail alone told investigators something important. Cases involving voluntary disappearances usually narrow over time. This one widened. According to publicly available reports, investigators continued collecting surveillance footage from businesses, residential streets, intersections, and traffic routes surrounding the neighborhood. The focus was no longer limited to what happened inside the home. The investigation had quietly shifted toward movement. Who entered the area, who left it, and whether any pattern connected those movements together. Think about that for a moment, because investigators understand something most people never see. A disappearance is rarely a single event. It is usually a sequence: arrival, approach, contact, departure. And investigators appear to believe at least part of that sequence may exist somewhere within the surrounding surveillance network. But there was another reason authorities became increasingly focused on movement: timing. According to official reporting, the disruption to surveillance systems and the later loss of Nancy's pacemaker signal occurred within a relatively narrow overnight period. Investigators have not publicly stated exactly what they believe happened during that window, but publicly available information strongly suggests they consider it central to the case. And this is where the investigation becomes unusually technical, because modern forensic reconstruction is no longer built only around fingerprints or eyewitnesses. It is built around synchronization, digital synchronization, vehicle synchronization, behavior synchronization. Investigators compare independent systems against one another, looking for overlap. A camera activates, a signal disappears, a vehicle passes an intersection, a phone disconnects. Separately, those moments may appear meaningless. Together, they can form a timeline. And investigators appear to be trying to build exactly that. According to reporting tied to the case, authorities continued analyzing forensic evidence recovered from the home while simultaneously expanding digital review efforts. Officials have remained careful about revealing exactly what evidence has been confirmed publicly. That caution matters, because experienced investigators rarely disclose sensitive forensic information while an investigation is active, not only to protect the case but also to preserve leverage. Think about that carefully. If investigators already know certain details privately, withholding them allows authorities to evaluate future tips, interviews, or statements against information only the responsible person would know. That is one reason investigators often speak carefully in public while working far more aggressively behind the scenes. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, the public silence surrounding certain forensic details has become almost as important as the details themselves. But that wasn't the only thing investigators appeared to notice. According to publicly available reports, investigators also examined whether the person seen near the surveillance system displayed familiarity with the property layout itself. That question matters more than many people realize, because criminal behavior changes depending on familiarity. Someone acting randomly moves differently from someone who already understands an environment. Random movement creates hesitation, familiar movement creates efficiency. And according to analysts following the case, investigators may be studying whether the individual's actions reflected confidence rather than uncertainty, not certainty of guilt, behavioral confidence. There's an important difference. This is one reason surveillance footage becomes so valuable in modern investigations, not simply because it captures images, but because it captures behavior, pace, direction, decision-making, body positioning, route selection. Investigators study all of it, and sometimes what matters most is not what a person does, but what they avoid doing. This is where the investigation appears to have entered a more analytical stage. Because if authorities believe someone intentionally disabled surveillance equipment, investigators naturally begin asking another question. Why that camera? Think about it carefully. Most people unfamiliar with a property would first need to identify where surveillance systems are located. That takes time, exposure, observation. But according to public reporting, investigators appear interested in the possibility that the individual approached the area with unusual purpose. Again, that does not confirm planning. But investigators clearly do not appear to be treating the surveillance disruption as accidental. And this is where the story shifts once more. Because the further investigators moved into forensic reconstruction, the less the case appeared to revolve around one isolated moment. Instead, authorities seemed increasingly focused on sequence. Not only what happened, but in what order did it happen? That distinction matters enormously in criminal investigations. Sequence exposes intention. For example, if surveillance systems failed before movement around the property occurred, investigators interpret that differently than if the systems failed afterward. One suggests preparation, the other suggests reaction. And according to publicly available reporting, investigators have spent significant time reconstructing that exact sequence. Meanwhile, public attention continued building around the unidentified man seen near Nancy Guthrie's home. Online speculation moved rapidly. The official investigation moved much more slowly. That difference became increasingly noticeable, because while internet discussions often centered around immediate conclusions, investigators continued focusing on verifiable evidence. That usually tells experienced analysts something important. Authorities believe unanswered questions still remain inside the evidence itself, and in this case, there appeared to be several. For example, if the individual seen near the property intended to avoid identification completely, why carry out activity within range of surveillance systems at all? That contradiction remains difficult to ignore, because even partial exposure creates risk. Unless the person believed identification would still be unlikely afterward, this is one reason investigators reportedly expanded their search beyond the immediate neighborhood and began analyzing broader movement routes connected to the area. According to analysts following the case, investigators may be attempting to determine whether any vehicle movement surrounding the disappearance appears coordinated across separate cameras and intersections. Not because authorities have confirmed multiple suspects, but because movement patterns sometimes reveal relationships evidence alone cannot immediately explain. And this is where logistics quietly become central again. Removing someone from a residential neighborhood requires more than opportunity. It requires timing. The smaller the time frame, the smaller the margin for error, which means investigators are likely examining whether the overnight timeline reflects improvisation or control, because control leaves structure, and structure leaves patterns. This is why investigators often revisit surveillance footage repeatedly over weeks or months. The first review identifies visible events. The later reviews identify overlooked consistency. A vehicle appearing twice, lights activating unexpectedly, movement slowing at specific intersections, routes that initially seemed ordinary. And sometimes investigators only recognize the significance of those details after reconstructing the broader timeline around them. But perhaps the most important question investigators still appear to face is this: was the disappearance itself the primary objective, or was the disruption of evidence equally important from the beginning? Think about that for a moment, because if surveillance systems were intentionally targeted early, investigators may eventually conclude the digital timeline was never incidental to the case. It may have been central to it. And if that possibility proves true, then the most important evidence in the Nancy Guthrie investigation may not be what investigators saw on camera, but what someone was trying to prevent cameras from seeing in the first place. As the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continued, one reality became increasingly clear to investigators. The case was no longer being treated as a search built around hope alone. It had become a reconstruction. According to publicly available reporting, authorities continued combining forensic evidence, digital analysis, surveillance review, and behavioral assessment into what investigators often describe as a total timeline examination. That process is slow, methodical, and often frustrating to the public, because unlike television investigations, real cases are rarely solved by one dramatic discovery. They are solved when enough separate details stop contradicting each other. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators appear to still be working toward that point. Think about that carefully. At the center of this investigation is not only the question of where Nancy is, it is the question of what sequence of events could realistically explain everything investigators already know publicly: the disrupted surveillance system, the unidentified individual near the property, the loss of digital signals, the absence of immediate visible chaos inside the home, the widening review of surrounding surveillance footage. Investigators are not looking at those details separately anymore. They are attempting to determine whether they belong to the same operational timeline. And this is where the investigation becomes especially difficult, because evidence does not always arrive in order. Sometimes investigators discover the ending first, then spend months identifying the beginning. According to analysts following the case, That may be one reason authorities have remained cautious about publicly characterizing exactly what they believe happened inside the home that night. Not because investigators necessarily lack theories, but because theories must survive evidence, and evidence changes. This is one reason experienced investigators often revisit earlier assumptions repeatedly during major cases. A detail that appeared insignificant during week 1 may become critical during month 3. A vehicle dismissed early may suddenly matter after digital evidence is reviewed. A timeline gap that seemed harmless may later become the center of the entire investigation. And authorities appear to understand that risk very clearly here, because publicly, investigators have avoided making definitive claims they cannot yet fully support. That restraint matters, especially in a case that has generated enormous public attention online, because once public narratives harden too early, they can distort witness memory, influence tips, and complicate investigative strategy itself. And according to law enforcement experts, that is one reason investigators often release information carefully and in stages, not only to gather evidence, but to evaluate reactions to the evidence they release. Think about that for a moment. Sometimes investigations are not only about finding information, they are about observing who reacts when information becomes public. This is especially important in cases involving uncertainty around movement, surveillance disruption, or timeline reconstruction. Because people connected to a case often adjust behavior once they believe investigators are moving closer to certain answers, and investigators know that. This is why analysts believe the expanding public pressure surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case may matter more than many people realize. The reward offers, the national media attention, the FBI involvement, the repeated public requests for surveillance footage and tips, each one increases pressure in different ways, not necessarily pressure on a confirmed suspect, but pressure on the timeline itself, pressure on silence, pressure on memory, pressure on mistakes. Because over time, investigations often become less dependent on one major breakthrough and more dependent on accumulated inconsistencies. One statement conflicts with another, a movement pattern no longer fits, a previously ignored sighting becomes relevant, a digital record suddenly aligns with physical evidence, and investigators slowly begin narrowing possibilities. This is why the Nancy Guthrie investigation appears increasingly centered around reconstruction rather than reaction. Authorities are no longer simply responding to a disappearance. They appear to be rebuilding an environment. Who was present, who moved through the area, what systems failed, what actions occurred before those failures, and whether those events connect logically once placed into sequence. Because sequence remains one of the most important concepts in the entire case. Not only what happened, but what happened first. Investigators understand that sequence often reveals intent more clearly than motive itself. For example, if surveillance systems were disrupted before any direct contact occurred, that suggests a very different behavioral pattern than if the disruption happened afterward. One reflects anticipation, the other reflects adaptation. And according to publicly available reporting, investigators appear deeply focused on reconstructing exactly that distinction. But there is another question quietly emerging beneath the surface of the investigation. A question that may ultimately determine whether this case was opportunistic, or whether it involved familiarity with Nancy Guthrie's routines, environment, or household systems beforehand. Because experienced investigators know something critical. Most people under pressure make mistakes inside unfamiliar environments. Yet publicly known details in this case suggest relatively limited visible disorder despite the complexity investigators appear to believe was involved. Think about that carefully. An elderly woman disappears. Digital systems stop communicating. Surveillance equipment is reportedly tampered with. An unidentified man is seen near the property. And yet investigators still appear to be working backward through the timeline instead of forward from a single obvious event. That usually means investigators believe the answers are hidden somewhere inside the structure of the timeline itself, not outside it, which may explain why authorities reportedly continue examining surveillance routes, forensic evidence, digital activity, and behavioral patterns together rather than separately. Because when investigators cannot immediately explain a crime scene physically, they often attempt to explain it structurally. What sequence makes sense, what sequence does not, what behavior fits the timeline, what behavior disrupts it, and eventually, contradictions begin eliminating possibilities one by one. But perhaps the most revealing detail in the entire investigation is not what investigators have publicly confirmed. It may be what they continue refusing to rule out, because despite months of investigation, authorities have still not publicly reduced the case to one simple explanation. Not a random disappearance, not a confirmed family crime, not a verified stranger abduction, not a solved forensic match. The investigation remains open across multiple possibilities. And that tells experienced investigators something extremely important. They may still believe the critical missing piece has not yet surfaced publicly. A piece capable of connecting movement, timing, digital silence, and physical evidence into one coherent sequence. Because right now, the Nancy Guthrie case appears to remain exactly where the most difficult investigations often stay the longest. At the point where investigators believe the truth exists somewhere inside the evidence, but the evidence has not yet arranged itself into a complete picture.